She was told her skin clashed with the cabin. A flight attendant sneered, yanked her bag from the overhead like it didn't belong, and motioned her to the back without a word, as if her presence alone had stained the luxury. No one intervened. A man took her seat without question. A woman whispered that the smell of her lotion was too bold for first class. Another laughed and said, "They're getting brave these days." She wasn't loud. She didn't argue. But every second she stayed quiet, they dug their own grave. One smirk, one insult, one rule bent just far enough to stay defensible. Because they thought she was powerless. They thought she was invisible. What they didn't know was that this wasn't just another black woman boarding a plane. It was the beginning of their downfall. And when that plane hits the ground, the truth won't ask for permission. It'll detonate. This isn't fiction. It's a reckoning at 35,000 feet. Like this video if you're ready to see what happens when arrogance meets reality. Subscribe for more stories that strike deep. And tell us, where are you watching from? And which moment made your blood boil? Let's talk. Asherine Baines moved through the jet bridge with quiet grace, the weight of the week settling on her shoulders, but not breaking her composure. She had booked this flight after 3 straight days of corporate boardroom warfare, a marathon of meetings, closed-door negotiations, and the kind of diplomacy that required stamina more than strategy. She wasn't dressed for display. Her outfit was pragmatic, dark gray wool slacks, a pressed olive blouse, and black walking shoes scuffed from use but immaculately clean. She didn't wear statement pieces. No designer scarf, no watch to flash, no expensive jewelry to whisper affluence. But her posture, shoulders straight, neck high, radiated something deeper than wealth. It was presence. As she entered the first-class cabin of Braemar Airlines Flight 712, that presence met its first barrier. Harlow Green stood near the cabin's bulkhead, clipboard in hand, blonde bun-tight and untouched by turbulence or humility. Her eyes caught Asherine's before her body did, and in that half-second appraisal, something shifted. Harlow's gaze traveled from the hem of Asherine's coat to the tips of her shoes. She didn't say anything yet, but the smirk pulling at one corner of her mouth spoke volumes. And when Asherine paused, reading the seat markers overhead to confirm she was at 2A, Harlow stepped forward, not to greet, not to assist, but to inspect. Her finger extended toward Asherine's left foot and tapped the stitched logo above the toe cap. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't aggressive. But it wasn't harmless. It was a gesture of ownership, of mockery, and of assumption. The unspoken message, "You don't belong here." Asherine didn't flinch. She met Harlow's stare for a single beat, then looked away, lifting her bag into the overhead compartment as if brushing off dust. Behind them, another flight attendant, shorter, darker hair, name tag reading Reese, approached with a subtle glance between the two women. Before Reese could say a word, Harlow spoke, her voice not loud, but loud enough. "This area's gotten looser lately," she said, more casual. Reese, still unsure what role she was supposed to play, nodded faintly. Then Harlow continued, eyes not leaving Asherine, asking if the boarding pass was hers, or maybe someone else's. Maybe a neighbor accidentally handed her the wrong envelope. Maybe the printout got swapped at the kiosk. The words were coded in artificial concern, but the meaning was cold. Asherine said nothing. She adjusted her seatbelt, pulled out a folded newspaper from her bag, and opened to the editorial section. She didn't need to respond. The silence itself was a wall, clean and sharp. But Harlow wasn't done. She pivoted slightly toward Reese again, her voice theatrical now. She said the phrase, "Interviews, not indulgence." She said, "This isn't exactly the waiting room at a job fair." The words dropped like slow leaks into the carpet, intentional, disguised as chatter, but aimed like darts. Asherine continued to read, eyes on the page, but the pressure in her temple tightened. Her breath came slower, deeper, steadier. In the seat behind hers, a man in his 50s adjusted his cuffs and muttered something into his phone. Another woman nearby gave a short laugh, clipped and awkward. No one intervened. No one offered a word. The cabin was a space of performance now, and Asherine was the scene no one wanted to admit they were watching. The cabin crew resumed pre-flight rituals. Sparkling wine flowed, hot towels appeared. The scent of citrus and starch danced through the air. When the pilot made his initial announcement, Harlow stood closer to Asherine than necessary, as though still waiting for her to make a mistake. There was a kind of anticipation in her stance, as if daring her to speak up, to crack, to rise. But Asherine didn't. She sat still, pen now in hand, marking a line across a notepad in deliberate, rhythmic strokes. Each letter she wrote was another refusal to give ground. Harlow walked away eventually, her heels clicking with each step, her face expressionless. But behind her poise there was irritation, an almost visible itch, like a plan interrupted. Asherine folded her newspaper, slipped it back into her briefcase, and stared out the window. The cabin felt tense but not confrontational. Yet, somewhere deep inside, she knew something else was coming. And it did. The scent of spice and tobacco preceded the man who now stood at the edge of her aisle, a white man in a double-breasted navy pinstripe, square jaw, clean shave, an age-sculpted confidence in his bearing that suggested he was used to being catered to without request. He gave her only a cursory glance before looking up at Harlow, who stood near the galley as if waiting for the cue. With a tight-lipped nod and a deliberate reach, Harlow stepped forward, opened the overhead bin above Asherine's seat, and pulled her suitcase down. It wasn't gentle. The bag thudded lightly against the aisle wall as she lowered it, then leaned in and whispered something to Reese, who approached with hurried steps and awkward hands. Reese took the bag from Harlow and began rolling it toward the rear of the cabin. The motion jolted Asherine out of her stillness. She turned her head slowly, eyebrows raised, voice quiet but unmistakable. "Excuse me," she said, though the words floated more like a statement than a request. Harlow didn't respond. Instead, she gestured toward the newly arrived man, who now stood expectantly beside the seat, clearly assuming it was his. "There's been a reassignment," Harlow said curtly. "We're correcting a clerical error." Her tone bore no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, only efficiency weaponized as justification. Asherine didn't move. Her hands remained where they were, but her eyes locked on Harlow's with a steady, measured defiance. "I have my ticket. I checked in on time. I was seated properly." The man next to her cleared his throat, a deep guttural sound that carried both irritation and entitlement. "Are we going to handle this, or should I call someone who can?" he said, not to anyone in particular, but clearly meant to accelerate the transition. Reese paused at the edge of the aisle, visibly caught between protocol and discomfort. Her grip on the handle of Asherine's suitcase tightened. "Ma'am," she began, "we really need to make sure all boarding assignments are." Her voice trailed off as Harlow stepped in again, this time with a sharper tone. "We don't need another delay. Kindly step aside and allow the gentleman to be seated." Asherine finally turned fully toward her, her voice calm but steel-laced. "Show me where it says this is no longer my seat." Harlow didn't budge. "There's no need for escalation," she said, then added with false brightness, "Let's all be reasonable, yes?" The man laughed, short, smug, and confident. "I don't think that's in the cards," he muttered. Another passenger 2 rows back leaned forward, pretending to scroll through emails but clearly listening. The tension had pulled taut across the first-class cabin like piano wire. "Do you have a problem with me specifically?" Asherine asked, voice low now, words sharp and deliberate. "Because if this is about protocol, I'd like to see it enforced equally." Harlow's reply was a flicker of a smile that never reached her eyes. "You're creating an unnecessary disruption," she said, then leaned closer. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." The man stepped forward, brushed past the side of Asherine's knee with a smirk, and dropped heavily into the seat. The thump of his body hitting the cushion felt like a gavel falling. Asherine didn't protest. She simply stood. She did it with silence, no sigh, no gasp, no gesture of indignation. But her movements were precise, each step down the aisle smooth and quiet as Reese trailed behind her with the bag. The new seat was 4 rows back. Not quite economy, not quite business. The no man's land of the air where those with money, but not influence, were sometimes stashed. The cabin crew called it overflow. Asherine sat in 6E, a narrow aisle seat with a view of the galley curtain. The air was denser here, more cluttered. She lowered her tray table and opened the newspaper again. Her hands didn't shake, but her jaw was tight now. There was a storm behind her eyes, a controlled one. Back in the first-class cabin, Reese stood awkwardly in the corner while Harlow bent toward the newly seated passenger and offered him a drink. "Apologies for the mix-up," she said, voice velvet. "Some passengers don't always understand how dynamic our seating systems can be." The man raised a glass. "Not a problem. Good to see standards are still being maintained up here." Reese shifted her weight, her fingers fidgeting with her pen. She glanced toward the rear of the cabin and watched as Asherine remained poised and still. Her bag remained under the seat, zipped, untouched. From the outside, she was composed. From the inside, a slow burning sensation was beginning to spread from her spine outward. Not rage, not sadness, something deeper. A sense of calculated exclusion masked beneath the veil of politeness. She was used to it, but familiarity did not make it less sharp. It only made it quieter and colder. The curtain between first class and the overflow section hadn't fully shut. Through the small slit where two panels failed to meet, she could see Harlow gliding through the aisle, pausing to pour drinks, whisper in ears, and lean over seats in that way that exuded both performance and privilege. Harlow's posture was no longer stiff, it was relaxed now, as if victory had settled into her shoulders. She had, in her eyes, restored the intended order of things, and the cabin mirrored her attitude. Some passengers had barely noticed the earlier exchange. Others had noticed and chosen indifference. A few had enjoyed the show. Those were the ones Harlow catered to with unspoken understanding. When she re-entered the middle section, she walked straight down the aisle toward Asherine with her shoulders back, the rhythm of her steps rehearsed like a stage cue. Asherine didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the closed newspaper in her lap, her fingers resting lightly along the fold. Harlow stopped at her row and leaned in. Her voice was low, but her breath reached Asherine's cheek. "Before you decided to board today," she murmured, "did you take a moment to look in the mirror?" Asherine turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me," she asked, though the tone was more about confirmation than confusion. Harlow smiled, but it was a mechanical expression, all teeth and calculation. "We just like to ensure that our passengers in premium cabins understand the visual standard we try to maintain," she said, tapping her own shoulder where a golden airline pin gleamed in the lighting. "Image matters up there." Asherine's hands tightened slightly. "I wasn't aware decency required a dress code." Harlow leaned even closer. "It doesn't, but refinement does." Her voice dripped with self-satisfaction. "You'd be surprised how much easier it is to blend into a space when you don't look like you're challenging it." A woman seated diagonally across the aisle, mid-40s, platinum bob, pearl earrings, soft cashmere sweater, had been watching with thinly veiled amusement. She gave a sudden short laugh, the kind that wasn't spontaneous but intended for an audience. Harlow straightened and turned toward her. "Everything all right, Mrs. Langdon?" The woman smiled, lips painted a subtle mauve. "Just fine," she said, her eyes still on Asherine. "I suppose it's one of those flights where the ambience doesn't quite match the ticket price." Harlow chuckled. "Well," she replied, tilting her head back toward Asherine without looking directly at her. "At least today we'll have something to include in our end-of-flight feedback forms. Perhaps a new category, visual disruption." Asherine heard it all. Every word, every pause meant for emphasis, every sideways glance meant to dehumanize without saying the words outright. The performance wasn't for her, it was about her. And yet, she didn't move. Her chest rose with steady breath. Her eyes dropped to the newspaper again, though she no longer read. She simply stared, letting the ink lines blur together. Harlow turned and moved on, her work apparently complete. But the damage didn't stay with her. It lingered. The next flight attendant who came by didn't offer Asherine a drink, didn't ask if she needed anything, didn't even make eye contact. She placed a tray on the seat beside her without a word, then left. The food on it was different. Smaller portion. No garnish. The utensils were plastic, not metal. The napkin was missing. Asherine let it sit there, untouched, Further up the cabin, laughter swelled. Someone clinked glasses. The man now occupying seat 2, stretched out and called for more wine. Reese, the younger attendant, emerged briefly from the galley with hesitation in her eyes. She paused near Asherine's row, glanced at the untouched tray, and opened her mouth slightly as if to speak. Then Harlow's voice echoed from the curtain, sharp and unmistakable. "Reese, we need you up front, please." Reese rose. "Right away," she called, and vanished behind the curtain. Time dragged. The lights dimmed to prepare for flight. The engine hum thickened, surrounding everything in a layer of dull vibration. Still, Asherine sat there, back straight, jaw tight. Her fingers finally moved again, not toward the food, but to the clasp of her leather bag beneath the seat. She opened it slowly and pulled out a small notebook. No electronics, no distractions, just paper and ink. On the first line she wrote a single word: observe. She drew a line underneath. All around her, the atmosphere had seemingly relaxed, the tension of her earlier displacement dissolving for everyone except her. Asherine felt none of the comfort the other passengers seemed to share. Instead, she felt a slow descent into something colder, something calculated, something ancient and recycled, now repackaged in uniforms and customer service training. It started quietly. 2 attendants appeared at her side, not Harlow this time, but 2 younger staffers with matching expressions that tried to feign professionalism but failed under the weight of discomfort. They didn't make eye contact. They didn't speak at first. One of them reached up to the overhead bin and opened it without asking. He grabbed the handle of her carry-on, the same one Reese had previously taken away, and began pulling it toward the rear of the cabin without a single word. The other placed a small envelope on her tray table. Inside was a new boarding stub, freshly printed, creased once down the middle. The seat number read 31F. The very last row, next to the rear lavatory, right beneath the engine, beside the galley door where carts were constantly slammed open and shut. Asherine looked down at the ticket and back up at the attendants. Only now did one of them speak. His voice was soft, lips barely parting. "We're just trying to make the flight smoother. Sometimes we offer flexible guests a better sense of space. You'll have more privacy back there." The lie was so transparent it didn't even qualify as an insult. It was a smokescreen, hastily deployed, poorly rehearsed. Asherine didn't argue. She simply stood. Not fast, not slow. She folded her notebook, placed it in her shoulder bag, adjusted the sleeves of her blouse, and began walking toward the rear of the plane. As she passed row 3, Harlow emerged from the galley like an actress hitting her mark. She stepped into the aisle with purpose and intercepted Asherine for a brief moment, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. The touch was not gentle nor affectionate. It had weight. It had meaning. It was a physical punctuation mark to a long paragraph of quiet aggression. "Sometimes," Harlow said with a smile that didn't soften her eyes, "it helps to know your ceiling before you choose a seat on a multi-million-dollar aircraft." Asherine didn't respond. Not verbally, but her shoulder tensed beneath Harlow's palm. That was enough. The silence made the remark land heavier than any comeback ever could. Harlow stepped aside. Asherine walked on. Every step toward the rear of the aircraft felt less like a relocation and more like an exile. The floor under her shoes trembled faintly with the rumble of the engines, a low, constant reminder that she was now riding in the part of the plane no one ever bragged about. When she reached row 31, she found her seat sandwiched between a bulkhead wall and a crying toddler held by a weary mother. The overhead bin above was already full. The flight attendant in this section didn't offer to make space. Instead, she gestured vaguely toward the front, as if expecting Asherine to find somewhere else for her belongings. Asherine crouched and tucked her bag beneath the seat in front of her, knees tight against the metal seat frame. She didn't expect comfort. That expectation had been surgically removed 2 cabins ago. The noise back here was louder, voices carried, children fussed, flight attendants exchanged orders in clipped tones. The scent of disinfectant was stronger too, mixing with something sour and stale that clung near the lavatory door. Asherine adjusted her posture, placing her palms on her knees, eyes forward. She was no longer seen. She had been erased from the curated world of first class, replaced by someone more suitable, someone easier to accommodate, someone whose presence wouldn't raise eyebrows or provoke discomfort. And all of it, every subtle maneuver, every step down in status, had been carried out without one single explicit slur, without one direct act of violence. This was the violence of manners, the brutality of bureaucracy, and it was masterfully executed. Back at the front of the plane, Harlow resumed her rounds, now fully at ease, her smile more genuine as she served wine to the new first-class occupant of 2A, who thanked her with a wink and a remark about how rare it was to be treated right these days. Reese reappeared near the curtain, her eyes briefly scanning the aisle toward the rear. She spotted the empty seat where Asherine had been, then quickly turned away before anyone noticed she was watching. The lights dimmed fully now, signaling takeoff. The wheels lifted. The cabin tilted. And Asherine felt the shift not just in gravity, but in perception. She had moved lower, but not just in altitude. She had been made small, systematically, precisely, permanently. A child behind her kicked the seat. But in the very last row, beside the rear galley, Asherine Baines sat in silence that was not her own. It was a silence imposed upon her by a system that cloaked cruelty in operational efficiency and disguised segregation as customer flow management. Her body remained upright, spine straight against the cheap cushioning of seat 31F, hands folded in her lap like a woman awaiting judgment. She had been moved, removed, reduced, and everyone had watched. No one had intervened. Above her, the call light glowed faintly, not hers, but another passenger's. She could hear footsteps coming down the aisle, the soft leather soles of a flight attendant's shoes moving toward the back with practiced rhythm. The person passed her without looking. No eye contact, no acknowledgement. Her presence was being actively ignored, scrubbed from the first-class cabin's memory like spilled wine from a white napkin. The injustice was done. Now came the part where it was to be forgotten. But the air in the cockpit was not free of knowledge. The captain, seated at the helm of this high-altitude theater, had been informed before takeoff. He had received a quiet report through his headset, relayed by Harlow as a routine notice. Passengers seating adjusted, minor disturbance resolved, cleared for departure. There had been no mention of targeting, of profiling, of silencing. Just neutral, digestible words. The captain, an older man with a reputation for timely flights and minimal disruptions, paused for a moment before giving clearance. He looked at the light blinking on his panel. He glanced once at the log. Then he gave the go-ahead. He pushed the throttle. He made a choice. And in that choice, Asherine's story was deemed unworthy of disruption. Farther forward, tucked somewhere between rows 14 and 15, a man in his 60s sat beside the window, watching her quietly. He had noticed. He had seen the exchange in first class. He had heard the tone in Harlow's voice, seen the quiet shake in Reese's hands, observed the forced smile during the drink service. And when he saw Asherine being escorted like a problem to be tucked away, something in his chest had tightened. For a moment, he had considered standing. He had looked at his wife. He had whispered, "This isn't right." She had nodded just barely. Then they had both looked away. And now, as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, he leaned slightly into the aisle, craning his neck to get a glimpse toward the rear. She was still there, stone still, unreadable, as if she were carved into the fuselage. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He turned back to his seat, eyes heavy with shame. In the galley, Lily, the youngest of the cabin crew, leaned against the storage cabinet, hands pressed against cold metal. Her heartbeat was uneven, her breath shallow. She had witnessed the entire interaction with a lump in her throat and a sick weight in her stomach. When Asherine had been pulled from first class, when her bag had been seized, when Harlow made that comment about ceilings and million-dollar aircraft, Lily had heard it all. And something inside her had broken. She had entered this career to serve with dignity, not to reinforce invisible chains. After takeoff, she had quietly approached Reese near the beverage cart. "We need to do something," she had whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the hum of the engines. Reese had looked at her with haunted eyes and muttered, "Don't. You don't know what Harlow can do." Lily had insisted. She was humiliated in front of everyone. That wasn't a protocol decision. Reese had dropped her voice lower. "Do you want to get pulled off the international route? Because that's what happens when you challenge her." The words landed like lead in Lily's stomach. The international route was everything. It meant better hours, more prestige, greater income. But more than that, it was a symbol that she had made it. That she was more than someone who poured coffee at 30,000 feet. And in that moment, Lily realized the quiet deal they were all a part of. Keep your mouth shut, keep your place. She didn't like it, but she didn't speak again. She returned to her duties. When she passed by Asherine's seat with the beverage cart, she kept her eyes forward. She offered drinks to passengers on either side, never turning to the woman who sat between them like a ghost in a sealed chamber. It hurt her more than she expected. Her conscience clawed at her with each step. Asherine, meanwhile, remained unmoved. Her notebook was closed. Her hands were still. Her posture hadn't changed. But her mind was anything but still. She was taking inventory, not just of actions, but of silences, not just of offenses, but of alliances that never came. She had seen the man in 15B look toward her. She had registered the hesitation in his shoulders. She had noticed Lily's nervous glance. She had marked the absence of accountability in every gesture around her. These were not simply people. They were parts of the machinery. Some rusting, some well-oiled, all complicit. Somewhere overhead, the fastened seatbelt sign chimed. The flight was entering light turbulence. Asherine felt the plane shudder slightly beneath her, but she didn't brace. She didn't flinch. She sat through it, upright and alert. Asherine Baines remained motionless, her posture a blend of discipline and detachment. But something had shifted, not just in the cabin or in her body language, but in the air itself. It was as if the walls around her had started to constrict, not physically, but procedurally. She could sense it before it even happened, the tightening of unseen authority. It began with another flight attendant, not Reese, not Lily, and certainly not Harlow. This one was a tall, narrow-eyed man with the sort of gait that suggested he didn't engage in dialogue, only enforcement. He moved with intent, not curiosity. He stopped by her row, leaned toward her without introducing himself, and said, "Ma'am, we'll need to speak with you." His tone was flat, void of explanation, carefully neutral like a script written by legal counsel. Asherine looked up slowly. "Now," she asked, "while we're midair." He didn't answer her directly. Instead, he gestured with his hand, palm up, an unspoken directive to rise. Asherine glanced around. No one else was being asked to move. No one else had been disturbed. But there were eyes on her, passengers across the aisle pretending not to watch while their bodies shifted slightly in their seats, their posture betraying curiosity wrapped in cowardice. She stood, again, quietly. She adjusted her jacket and picked up her shoulder bag, but not before sliding her notebook inside. Her movements were deliberate, controlled. She had already learned that outbursts made you guilty. Resistance made you a threat. Silence, however, made you forgettable. And she needed to remain underestimated. The attendant led her toward the midsection of the plane, where a small auxiliary galley had been cleared. It wasn't meant for passenger interaction. It was a space used for storage and crew movement, but now it had become an impromptu chamber. She was told to wait. She stood there, pressed against the thin panel wall, the sound of clinking ice and rolling carts nearby, and waited. Another attendant entered, one she had seen before, but not interacted with. Her uniform was pristine, her badge sharp and polished. She stepped in, looked Asherine over, and said quietly, "This won't take long." The phrase was code. It meant, "This isn't about you." It meant, "This won't be resolved with truth." It meant, "You have no power here." Minutes passed, then Harlow entered. She did not look tired. She did not look surprised. She looked victorious. She carried a tablet in one hand and kept her other hand behind her back, as if this were a meeting, not a manipulation. Her voice was firm, but performed politeness like a mask. "There have been complaints," she began, eyes not meeting Asherine's. Disruptive behavior. Disregard for cabin crew instruction. Possible verbal escalation. She said it all with the casual delivery of someone reciting weather patterns, not accusations. Asherine did not interrupt. Harlow continued. Normally, we would address this on the ground. But for the comfort of our passengers, we're moving you to a secure holding seat for the remainder of the flight. The secure holding seat. It was a euphemism. It meant being moved again, but this time not just to the back. It meant confinement, isolation, the kind of treatment typically reserved for intoxicated passengers or physical threats. Not someone who had remained silent through every indignity. Asherine raised an eyebrow. What exactly did I do that threatened passenger safety? She asked. One of the attendants standing near the exit door leaned in slightly, her voice low but sharp. You didn't follow instructions, and some guests felt uncomfortable. The word uncomfortable was sharp enough to pierce skin. It was the justification of every systemic wrong in the book. Harlow turned, nodded once, and exited the galley. No further clarification. No effort to verify. Just decision, execution, and dismissal. Another crew member arrived with a paper form and asked Asherine to sign a report stating that she had been advised of her seat change for procedural reasons. Asherine did not touch the pen. She looked at the form, read it carefully, then looked at the attendant and said nothing. The form was returned and signed. Still, she was escorted, this time not to a row, but to a fold-down jump seat behind the rear galley. There was no window. There was no tray table. There was no footroom. It was a space designed to punish. She was buckled in by a staff member, hands guiding the belt across her hips, as if she were a child incapable of understanding how to secure herself. Please remain seated here until further notice, the staff member said, voice flat. And then they were gone. The curtain closed. The galley returned to life. The carts continued to clatter. The drinks continued to pour. The hum of the aircraft remained unchanged. But Asherine was now removed from the passenger manifest, not officially, but socially, emotionally, atmospherically. She had become invisible. She sat with her back against a cold panel wall, knees pressed together, the buzzing engine close enough to vibrate the floor under her shoes. She was not crying. She was not trembling. She was calculating. Because buried inside the soundproof veneer of that jump seat was something more dangerous than grief. It was memory. Every comment, every touch, every policy misused as a weapon, every silence that endorsed injustice. And then, just before the hour mark into the flight, a voice broke through the white noise. A whisper. A young male attendant, the same who had pulled her bag earlier, had slipped through the galley curtain under the guise of inventory check. As he passed her, he muttered under his breath without stopping, "You're just a passenger. They'll forget about you the moment we land." He didn't stop walking. He didn't look back. And yet his words stayed behind like oil slick on water. You're just a passenger. And in that sentence was the whole truth. Though no one was watching her anymore, she still carried herself with the poise of someone aware that even in exile, dignity must be maintained. The world might choose to reduce her, but she would not cooperate in her own belittlement. The humiliation she endured had calcified into focus. There was no rage in her eyes now, no visible anguish. There was only strategy. Hidden in her coat pocket was a device no larger than a lipstick tube. With the lightest motion, she withdrew it and turned it in her palm. It was an encrypted comms dongle, linked via satellite to a private relay system that bypassed commercial networks. She had used it only twice before in 3 years. This was the third. Tucking it discreetly between her fingers, she slid out her phone, opened a secure protocol application, and connected to the aircraft's Wi-Fi. The connection was weak, but it was enough. She typed a single command phrase into the app, flight status request, executive override protocol, codename Westridge. Seconds later, a silent prompt blinked across her screen, verified. Command accepted. Send activation instructions? Asherine tapped a secondary code, then wrote a brief encrypted message that began with the words, "Full incident escalation. Video capture advised. Contact Braemar Holdings Legal and M&A Counsel. Initiate pre-call documentation. Notify Chairman's Office. Then she signed it with her internal ID. VP Ops/Direct Authority Flag Alpha. She hit send. The message disappeared into the ether, a signal barely detectable unless one knew precisely where to listen. And that signal began to change everything. High above the Atlantic Ocean, Flight 712 continued on its trajectory, but the status of its internal power structure had just shifted without a sound. Down the aisle, behind the curtain of first class, Harlow stood at the service station with a glass of sparkling wine in one hand, casually chatting with the man now occupying Asherine's original seat. Their laughter was quiet, but it was the kind of confidence that only grew in the absence of consequence. They believed the disruption was over. They believed the problem had been handled. They believed she had no voice, no reach, no name. Elsewhere, Lily stood silently in the galley, chewing her lip as she observed Reese typing something into a tablet, clearly documenting the seating report in vague terms. Cabin adjustment initiated due to passenger noncompliance. Risk management assessed. Incident de-escalated. Lily frowned but said nothing. She had already been warned once. Still, something about the language stung. Noncompliance meant nothing when a woman had never raised her voice, never moved out of line. De-escalated meant silenced. But before she could question it, something strange happened. The intercom crackled. Just briefly, a tiny pop through the speakers. Then silence. Moments later, another sound emerged. Not a typical announcement, but a coded internal ping only heard by senior cabin crew. Harlow's pager vibrated against her hip. She looked down and saw an unfamiliar string of numbers scrolling across the screen. Her eyes narrowed. It was a direct board-level access code, only used in corporate emergencies. She turned sharply toward the flight phone and picked it up, entering a sequence she had only been trained on during simulations. The line connected to someone she didn't expect. On the other end, a firm, icy voice said, "This is Braemar Holdings. Who am I speaking with?" Harlow hesitated. "This is Lead Attendant Green, Flight 712. You've been flagged for immediate inquiry," the voice continued. "A call has been initiated by a primary executive stakeholder currently on board your aircraft. Identify their location and status immediately." Harlow blinked. "There must be a mistake." "There's no one," the voice interrupted. "You've been flagged by VP Ops, Direct Flag Alpha. Respond now." It took her a moment to comprehend what she was hearing. Then her face paled. The entire tone of her posture collapsed. In the aft galley, one of the senior officers received the same code through his handheld device. It was a board-activated emergency summons. They were being watched. And the person they had forcibly removed from first class, stripped of dignity and ignored, was not just a passenger. She was the Executive Vice President of Operations for the holding company currently finalizing a $2.5 billion acquisition deal with the very airline they worked for. And that meant everything they had done was not just misconduct. It was corporate sabotage. In the background, Lily watched the color drain from Harlow's face. "Who is she?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. "Who did you move to the back of the plane?" Harlow didn't answer. She couldn't. Because for the first time, she realized that the woman she had treated as disposable held more power than anyone on this plane, including the pilot. And she had just triggered a board-level emergency mid-flight. A minute later, the intercom system clicked again. This time, the captain's voice came through, strained, uncertain. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have received a corporate instruction to initiate a secure communication protocol. Senior cabin crew, report to the forward station." Passengers shifted in their seats. Confusion rippled down the rows. No turbulence, no medical emergency, just a voice that sounded suddenly very afraid. In the back of the plane, Asherine heard every word. She didn't smile. The usual announcements, "Thank you for flying, please remain seated, welcome to your destination," were conspicuously absent. The captain's voice had not returned since the Madeira directive, and the crew's posture had shifted into something tight and muted. Harlow stood rigid near the forward galley, her hands gripping the edge of a silver cart, eyes locked on nothing, jaw clenched so tightly that her cheek twitched. Reese hovered near the emergency door, her hands folded but her knuckles white. Lily stood at the back of the aircraft, near the curtain where Asherine had spent the last hours, though now that seat sat empty. Asherine had been quietly escorted mid-flight back to the middle of the aircraft at the direct instruction of the captain, not with apology, not with reverence, but with bureaucratic formality that no longer masked the truth. They didn't know what to do with her, so they placed her where they couldn't ignore her anymore. But it was too late. The damage had crystallized into consequence. The plane rolled toward a private hangar, not the usual terminal jet bridge, and outside the windows, passengers began to notice something strange. There was a line of black SUVs waiting on the edge of the runway. Several men in dark suits stood in a protective half circle, earpieces coiled along their collars. A step away from them stood a woman in a structured navy jacket, flanked by two assistants, holding a clipboard and a secure tablet, her expression unreadable. Nearby, cameras, lights, microphones, not the kind brought by accident, but those arranged with precision and authority. Inside the cockpit, the captain had received final instruction. He was to hold the passengers momentarily. An operations team was boarding. When he asked under what authority, the response came sharply: corporate executive override, signed by Chair Bronstein, time-stamped within the hour. That meant no further discussion. The door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and the first man to step on board was not airport staff, not security, not press. It was the general counsel of Braemar Holdings, wearing a tailored black suit, expression severe, carrying a leather folder embossed with a gold crest. He stepped into the first-class cabin and paused. "I need to speak with Asherine Baines immediately," he said, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. Harlow twitched. Lily took a step back. Reese said nothing. Then, slowly, from row 14, Asherine rose. She was calm, composed, expression neutral. She wore the same clothing she had boarded in, creased from hours of friction against prejudice. But somehow her presence had grown. The lawyer approached her with quiet deference. "Ma'am, we're ready when you are." She nodded, stepped into the aisle, and began walking forward. And for the first time in this entire flight, every passenger watched her not with dismissal, not with mockery, but with the stunned awe of people realizing they had misjudged someone entirely. She passed the man who had taken her seat. He looked down. She passed Mrs. Langdon, who now shifted awkwardly in her cashmere and didn't dare meet her eyes. She passed Harlow. The woman didn't move, didn't speak. Asherine didn't pause, didn't gloat, didn't look back. Outside the aircraft, the cameras didn't flash immediately. There was no sensationalism in the way she exited. But the moment she stepped down onto the tarmac, the lead communications officer for Braemar stepped forward and began a prepared statement. Effective immediately, she announced, voice clear, tone final. Braemar Holdings has chosen to suspend all acquisition activity with Delta Crown Airlines due to a verified violation of corporate ethics and anti-discrimination policy involving one of our executives. The words landed like thunder. Inside the plane, gasps rippled. One woman clutched her purse tighter. A man swore under his breath. And in the crew galley, Harlow dropped her hands from the cart and staggered back against the counter. "We didn't know," she muttered, but no one was listening. The CEO of Delta Crown Airlines arrived by car 10 minutes later, his suit wrinkled from a rushed ride, his face pale. He stepped onto the tarmac, adjusting his tie as he approached the press line. When he saw Asherine standing calmly beside the legal team, he stopped short. "Ms. Baines," he said, half whisper, half plea. She turned toward him. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," she said simply. "It was a reflection." The camera shutters clicked. The CEO blinked. The general counsel handed him a formal letter of withdrawal, signed and sealed. The media surrounded them, but Asherine remained still. A silent storm in tailored wool. On board the aircraft, word spread fast. Reese sat down in an empty seat and stared blankly ahead. Lily cried silently in the galley. The man in 15B closed his laptop and buried his face in his hands. The pilot didn't leave the cockpit. He stayed behind the door. He didn't want to face the people who had been part of what just happened. But it was no longer a private matter. Hours after Flight 712 touched down and the corporate announcement reverberated through the aviation and financial sectors, the executive boardroom became a war room. And in that room, there were names, specifics spelled out, time-stamped, attached to decisions, omissions, and actions. At the top of that list was Veronica Harlow Green. She was summoned that same evening, not by a supervisor, not by human resources, but by a compliance officer from Braemar's external legal counsel. When she walked into the makeshift inquiry suite, she was still wearing her uniform, still trying to maintain posture, but her eyes betrayed the panic bubbling just beneath her practiced poise. On the table sat a single tablet, already opened to a secured file with hours of surveillance footage, passenger statements, transcribed audio logs, and time-coded communications sent via in-flight messaging. There was no ambiguity. Every word she'd spoken, every micro-gesture of contempt, every moment of dismissive behavior toward Asherine had been documented by someone. Passengers, junior crew, flight logs. There were receipts. Her hands shook slightly when she reached for the chair. The compliance officer didn't bother with pleasantries. "You are being released from your duties effective immediately," he said. "There will be no severance. Your access to airline systems has been revoked. Do you have any questions before we proceed?" Veronica opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She tried again, her voice brittle. I want to speak to legal." The officer nodded once and slid a card across the table. "You're entitled to representation, but I suggest you review the evidence first. Most firms decline discrimination defense when there's visual proof of systemic abuse." She didn't take the card. She stared at it like it was a weapon. She had expected maybe a suspension, maybe a quiet transfer. But this erasure, this swift execution of authority, was something she hadn't prepared for. Within minutes, her airline badge was clipped from her uniform, her credentials disabled, and her name removed from the employee roster. She stood in the hallway after the meeting, trembling fingers dialing her attorney, stammering into voicemail. "I need help. It's not what it looks like. They're making it sound like but it was exactly what it looked like." And everyone now knew. The story was no longer confined to a plane. It was on every business channel, in every HR compliance forum, on every internal review document at competing airlines. Meanwhile, the consequences didn't end with her. The pilot, who had knowingly allowed the in-air mistreatment of an executive passenger, was issued a notice of suspension pending review. The review board didn't just cite his failure to act, they cited his failure to report, his complicity in allowing crew-led retaliation, and his passive alignment with discriminatory practice. His flight history was flawless, his discipline record clean, but none of it shielded him. His first-class authority had failed the one moment it truly mattered. He had been silent, and silence had become guilt. The cabin supervisor was next. Documents showed he had received 2 prior complaints, both from passengers of color who had reported subtle mistreatment in premium cabins. Those complaints had been dismissed due to lack of corroboration. But now, with Asherine's case laying bare the entire structure of enablement, his previous inaction was reevaluated. He had ignored signs, buried reports, and when given the chance to do something, he had chosen convenience over confrontation. Within 48 hours, a federal inquiry was opened by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The charge: systemic discrimination in service design, crew training, and internal promotion practices. Braemar Holdings, though no longer a partner, submitted all data collected during the incident. Internal emails, training manuals, audio from cabin communications, a full paper trail. And the commission responded. Interviews were scheduled, audits announced. The airline's compliance department was gutted overnight, replaced with an external team. Within the HR ranks, a quiet panic spread. Some tried to erase chat logs. Some deleted internal messages. But the servers had already been mirrored. The cleanup was not coming from within, it was coming from above. Even senior executives, who had once courted Braemar with confident smiles and champagne toasts, were now sitting in glass-walled conference rooms, answering to ethics officers in gray suits and cold voices. When did you learn of Ms. Bain's role? They were asked. Did her removal from first class follow standard escalation policy? How many similar incidents have occurred in the past 12 months? What role does unspoken bias play in customer-facing interactions at Delta Crown? No one had good answers, because they had never been asked to think about those answers before. In the weeks that followed, stock plummeted. Public apologies were drafted, rewritten, delayed. Training programs were paused, relaunched, rebranded. But none of it moved fast enough to shield those who had stood by and watched. Passengers who had been on Flight 712 began speaking out. One woman wrote a blog post titled the day, "I watched power get erased and restored." Another passenger submitted video clips to a news outlet, quiet footage of Asherine's notebook, of Reese's discomfort, of Lily wiping her face in the galley. It all began to coalesce into one thing: truth. And truth has a cost. For Veronica, it was the end of a 15-year career and the beginning of a public identity she would never escape. For the pilot, it was a grounded future. For supervisors, it was an unrelenting examination of what they had allowed to fester. Time, though it cannot undo harm, has a way of measuring consequence. In the months following the downfall of Delta Crown's reputation, the world moved on with the rhythm of global headlines. Yet those who had been at the center of Flight 712's unraveling could not escape the echo of that one airborne reckoning. Veronica Harlow disappeared from the spotlight after her termination, avoiding public appearances and declining interview requests. But silence became unbearable as her name began to appear in industry panels, not as an expert, but as a case study. Her image was featured in ethics training modules. Her decisions were dissected in classrooms. Her behavior, once unchallenged, had become a warning. 3 months after her dismissal, a letter surfaced online. It wasn't released through her attorney or any media outlet, but posted quietly on a nonprofit's internal newsletter, an organization focused on rehabilitation for professionals removed from power due to ethical breaches. The letter didn't ask for redemption. It didn't shift blame. It began with 6 plain words: "I saw her and looked away." In it, Veronica admitted to failing not just a passenger, but herself. She detailed the moments she chose to act unbiased, the thrill of false control, the slow realization that the woman she had dismissed carried more strength in silence than she had ever held in command. The message didn't go viral. It wasn't performative, but those who needed to read it found it. Even more unexpected was where she chose to go next. Months after the letter, Veronica began appearing quietly, humbly, as a volunteer with a nonprofit legal clinic that provided guidance to victims of discrimination in public services. She didn't speak often. She didn't sign forms as a former airline supervisor. She poured coffee. She filed case folders. She listened. The people who worked there didn't always know her story. Some did. Some chose to withhold judgment. Some didn't care. But those who remembered saw something different in her eyes. Not guilt, but the heavy weight of understanding. Elsewhere, Lily had chosen a different path. She left Delta Crown quietly after the investigation closed and joined a regional airline with a progressive training program focused on empathy in service. When asked why she changed employers, she simply said, "Because I needed to remember why I started." Reese took a sabbatical, citing burnout, but enrolled in a certification course on workplace advocacy soon after. The pilot was never reinstated. The supervisor resigned. Internal policy at Delta Crown was rebuilt from the ground up, not as a press release, but as a contractual requirement demanded by new investors. But the most transformative moment came 1 year later, almost to the day. It wasn't a public apology or a television documentary. It was a quiet conference held in a private hotel in New York, organized under the title Reconstructing Service: Equity at Altitude. The room wasn't grand. It was small, intentional. At the front stood a long table with nameplates, not just for speakers, but for listeners. and in the center of that space stood Asherine Baines. She was not introduced as an executive. She didn't arrive with fanfare. She walked to the podium with a binder tucked under one arm, a digital tablet in the other. Her voice, calm and steady, began the session not with condemnation, but with memory. "There was a moment," she said, "when I sat in the back of a plane, beside a bathroom, wondering how long dignity could survive when surrounded by silence." She didn't speak long. She didn't need to. What she said next was what stayed with the room. "I don't believe justice ends with punishment. I believe it begins with recognition and continues with accountability and survives only through learning." Then she stepped aside, and those who had once sat above her, figuratively and literally, took their place at the front row of the audience. Former crew members, new supervisors, policy consultants, all attending not because they were required, but because the world they knew had changed, and she was now one of the people shaping its new direction. The session included exercises that mirrored the moments from Flight 712, recreated seating conflicts, scripted escalations, and most importantly, pauses. Moments where participants were asked not to react, but to reflect. One former employee, seated at the back, whispered afterward, "I thought I knew how to serve. I didn't know how to see." By the end of the day, attendees received no certificates, no medals. They received a question printed on the final slide. "What do you do when power isn't watching, but conscience is?" That line, Asherine later explained, had come from her notebook on the flight, the very one she had used to record the slow erasure she endured. In that same hotel hallway, she crossed paths with Veronica. No entourage, no press, just two women who had once occupied the same aisle from very different altitudes. They spoke briefly, not for headlines, not for forgiveness, but because sometimes reckoning ends not with a gavel, but with two people simply recognizing what once went unseen. Outside the hotel, the sky was clear. Somewhere far above, another flight ascended. And this time, someone like Asherine sat in seat 2A unmoved, unchallenged, unseen in the best way possible. Seen as equal, seen as whole. The world had shifted. Maybe not enough, but undeniably forward. The end. If this story moved you, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps us bring more real, powerful narratives to light. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it the silence, the shift, or the final reckoning? Let us know in the comments. And before you go, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Your perspective matters here.